is to beware of a lack of faith. You ever notice a spider or a spider's web, the way it's designed? Very frail or fragile to the human touch. But actually, pound for pound, a spider's web is as strong, if not stronger, than steel. And the way a web is designed is very beautiful, but from some angles, you can't even see it. But if you turn slightly a certain way, then it appears. And its design is so intricate and made so lovely. Sometimes insects don't even see it. They fly right into it. That's the way it's designed to be put together. But it's not the web so much that catches them initially at first, because the insect feels relatively safe thinking that I can get out of this. But what the insect doesn't know is while it's wrapped up in its web at first, the whole web is designed with feelers or vibrations all throughout the web so that the spider who's waiting on the other side of it or on the outskirts of it can feel the insect move in any direction. And what the insect doesn't know also is that spaced out literally a few millimeters, every few millimeters, is little tiny droplets of glue. So the insect moves a little bit to the left, it gets caught up. Now it tries to roll a little bit to the right, it gets caught up. And now all of a sudden, this easy trap that they thought that they could get out of, they are entangled in. And soon the spider comes down and traps them. Now what's interesting is that Satan has a powerful weapon like that too, that can easily entangle us. We can easily get caught up in a web of things, of sin and desires, thinking that we can easily get out of it. But we don't realize that the master web maker, Satan, has put a very intricate web design in front of us. Paul calls it the sin that easily entangles us. Why is this a dangerous trap? The sin that easily entangles us. Well, open your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 3, verse 12, and we'll see what this sin is. What is this sin that easily entangles us? Just like that insect, before we get into it, before we realize it, we're trapped. We're caught just like that insect. Hebrews 3:12 says, "Beware, brothers, for fear there should ever develop in any of you a wicked heart lacking faith by drawing away from the living God." The sin that can easily entangle us is a wicked heart lacking faith. And what it causes us to do is to draw away from Jehovah. Now what we're going to examine this evening is the context of Paul's writing. Why did he write this in Hebrews chapter 3? What we need to do is to get a little background on this whole account, and then we can establish his reasoning, why he thought that this was so important for us to understand. Well, a little background of Hebrews chapter 3. Paul wrote this letter to the Christian congregation around the year 61 CE. It was just 9 years before that foretold destruction that we talked about in our book study that Jesus had proclaimed was going to happen. Now, the brothers in Judea were trying to carry on their worship in a very calm way. They were trying to carry out their newfound Christian hope in their ministry according to what their leader Jesus had told them. But during that time, they were facing stiff opposition from Jewish fanatics back then. During that time period, the Insight volume says it was a time of crucial testing that came to be upon the Jewish congregation back there. Only a few years earlier, the mere appearance of Paul in Jerusalem, just his showing up, stirred up controversy. Religious Jews screamed at the top of their voices when they looked at Paul, saying, "Take such a man away from the earth, for he is not fit to live." And more than 40 Jews had bound themselves with a curse, saying that they would not eat or drink until Paul had been killed. Now, in that atmosphere of religious fanaticism and hatred for Christianity, this small congregation, the Hebrew congregation, had to preach, keep themselves alive, and keep themselves spiritually fed. They needed encouragement and reminders that their faith was superior to what the Jews were showing them. Even though the Jews were pointing to that beautiful temple with its gold and silver carvings, all its ornaments, and the history of the priesthood, and the whole beautiful arrangement of everything that was there in Jerusalem, and how wonderful this looked, the Jews had to stay focused on their leader, who had died and now had risen, and their tiny group that was now trying to preach. And they had to be convinced that what they had was better than that whole Jewish system of things, that whole arrangement. And Paul was writing that letter to remind them, do not go back to these former things. For what you have is better. Your faith is better. Do we have a parallel today? Can we see similar things happening today? Well, Paul wrote this warning, going back to Hebrews chapter 3. This time, look at verses 7 through 11. Paul says, for this reason, just as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you people listen to his own voice, do not harden your hearts as on the occasion of causing bitter anger, as in the day of making the test in the wilderness, in which your forefathers made a test of me with a trial, and yet they had seen my works 40 years. For this reason I became disgusted with this generation and said, they always go astray in their hearts, and they themselves have not come to know my ways. So I swore in my anger, they shall not enter into my rest. Now what Paul was actually quoting from was an account or a thought found in Psalms chapter 95, verse 8. But interestingly, in these verses we read, he uses the term about them being, they were disgusted, he was disgusted with this generation, and they had gone astray and they kept testing him. Well, when he quotes from Psalms 95, he doesn't use the words occasion for bitter anger or making a test. Actually, the words that are quoted there in Psalms are the words Meribah and Massah. Meribah, which means quarreling, and Massah, which means testing. Why are those words, Meribah and Massah, interchangeable with quarreling and testing, referring to the Jews? Well, let's do some research in this account. Let's go back to Exodus. And we can go back to the book of Exodus to see why those terms, Meribah and Massah, were interchangeable with quarreling and testing, and what they had to do with Paul warning them about not going back to what they had known before. Now, we're going to do a little background reading and scanning. In Exodus chapter 14, this account is familiar to us. Exodus 14 recounts the destruction of the Egyptians at the Red Sea. Now we know the Great Sea was split in two, and over 1 million Jews and a vast mixed company walked through these huge congealed walls of the Red Sea unharmed. Now so vast was this mixed company, we know that it took almost all night for them to cross. But the Egyptian armies, when they followed, they didn't make it. They were destroyed. The walls of that water came down upon them, and they were destroyed. If you look at chapter 15, this chapter talks about a great victory song about that fight. And in Exodus 15, verse 1, it talks about singing praise to Jehovah, because he is the most exalted. The horse and the rider he is pitched into the sea. And all of this chapter is a victory song showing Jehovah's saving power over his enemies. But that victory song didn't last too long. That faith they had did not last too long. Because just 3 days later, after this event happened, if we look at verse 22, just 3 days into the wilderness, they did not find water. In time, they came to Marah, or Massah, translated there in Psalms, but they were unable to drink the water from Marah because it was bitter. That is why it was called Marah. And the people began to murmur against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" So he cried out to Jehovah. So Jehovah directed him to a tree, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. So as we read the account further, he has the water, the tree thrown into the water. It becomes sweet. Now this bitter water they were unable to drink miraculously becomes sweet. And notice why he does this. Continue reading. There he, Jehovah, established for them a regulation and a case for judgment, and there he put them to the test. And he went on to say, "If you will strictly listen to the voice of Jehovah your God, and you will do what is right in his eyes, and you will indeed give ear to his commandments, and you will keep all his regulations, I shall put none of the maladies upon you that I put upon the Egyptians, because I am Jehovah who is healing you." Basically, the scripture is saying that he would provide for them everything if they put faith in him. Now, after seeing all the miracles, the 10 plagues, the destruction of the Egyptians, the miracle of the water bitter becoming sweet, all the rules of the game were laid out to them. Simply, it was this: obedience and faith equal blessing. You listen to what I say, and as that verse says, I will be a healing to you. That's what he said. But notice what happens in chapter 16. In verse 2 it says, the entire assembly of the sons of Israel began to what? Murmur against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the sons of Israel kept saying to them, "If only we had died by Jehovah's hand in the land of Egypt, while we were sitting by the pots of meat, while we were eating bread to satisfaction." Then Jehovah said to Moses, "Here I am raining down bread from you from the heavens, in order that I may put them to the test as to whether they will walk in my law or not." So again, Jehovah puts the stipulation there. This is the test. This is a test. If you follow my rules and regulations, you receive blessings. So what happens? The rest of this chapter shows that this miraculous food from heaven was introduced, manna. An instruction in the rest of this chapter is given as regards to its collection and the eating and the preparation of this miracle food, manna. And also Jehovah lovingly provided quail as meat for them. Now Moses again warns them in verse 8, the latter part of verse 8. He says, "Because Jehovah has heard your murmuring, that you are murmuring against him. And what are we? Your murmuring are not against us, but against Jehovah." So he warned them again, when you murmur, it's not against me and Aaron, it's against Jehovah. So you know the ground rules. Obedience and faith equals blessing. Learn from your mistakes. Follow what Jehovah's saying. Now with all that background, look at chapter 17. Verse 1. Then the sons of Israel went camping at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. Now, what would they do? Would they remember the test? Would they remember the equation? Faith and obedience equals blessings. Would they not lack faith? Would they not go back to their former way of thinking, their former complaints, their former self-centered me spirit? Would they remember the miracles that was just done a few days ago? Look at verse 2. And the people fell to quarreling with Moses and saying, "Give us water that we may drink." But Moses said to them, "Why are you quarreling with me? Why do you keep putting Jehovah to the test?" At that point, Moses even fears for his life. Look at verse 4. He cries to Jehovah saying, "What shall I do with this people? A little longer and they'll stone me." Jehovah comes to the rescue again. He says, "Take the rod that you used earlier, strike the rock, water will come out, and the people have to drink it." Now we see the connection. Look at verse 7. So he called the name of this place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarreling of the sons of Israel, and because of their putting Jehovah to the test, saying, Is Jehovah in the midst of us or not? A lesson. Orally. Testing. Now we see why those terms are interchangeable. Paul was warning the Jews back then, don't go back to the former temple, because all it is a former way of doing things. It's not the direction that Jehovah is leading us in. Don't go back to those old ways, those old selfish, self-centered ways of doing things. What was the problem with the Israelites back then, and the Israelites, and the Jews at that time that were trying to conform this new congregation to go back to their old way of doing things? Look at Hebrews chapter 3. We'll go back to Hebrews chapter 3. And we're going to stay in this chapter the rest of the discussion. Hebrews chapter 3 verse 10 says, "For this reason I became disgusted with this generation and said, they always go astray in their hearts, and they themselves have not come to know my ways." What was the problem with both generations and the application today? Well, this generation went astray in their heart. They didn't come to know Jehovah personally. You see, they were so distracted with their physical anxieties, their physical wants, their desires. My bread, my meat, my water. They were so concerned with me and myself that they weren't getting to know Jehovah. Jehovah had done all these miracles for them, provided all this assistance for them, and all they could focus in on was themselves, me. They knew Jehovah, they knew of Jehovah, but they didn't come to know Jehovah, his ways. They hadn't developed confidence and trust in his ability to care for his people. They were only concerned with their immediate needs, exactly like the Jews in Paul's time. They just saw the temple and its immediate gratification, and they couldn't look beyond and see the hope that Jesus had laid out for them. Well, what was the result? Because the Israelites could not see beyond their immediate physical desires. Look at verse 11. "So I swore in my anger, they will not enter into my rest." Yes, because of their lack of faith, they lost the privileges of entering into the promised land. So there is a lesson for us today. What's the lesson? Look at verses 12 and 13. "Beware, brothers, for fear there should ever develop in any of you a wicked heart, lacking faith, by drawing away from the living God. But keep exhorting one another each day as long as it may be called today, for fear any of you should become hardened by the deceptive power of sin." Yes, Phillips Modern English Version says of that same phrase, hardened by the deceptive power of sin, it says that the wickedness of the heart which refuses to trust. The wickedness of the heart which refuses to trust. Why is trust an issue here? Well, if we think about it, the Israelites, as we mentioned, got to know God, but they didn't know him as a God of saving power, someone that they could trust and put their devotion in. And today, Satan has attacked our trust, our ability to trust, to love. And if our trust is always attacked, there's no way we can get to know Jehovah. Because Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 says, trust Jehovah with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. And because our ability to trust has been damaged by Satan and his wicked system and by others in this world, it's a leap of faith for us to step forward and say, I'm going to trust. I'm going to put my heart and soul into this. But without that trust factor, our heart starts to harden. And that's when the deceptive power of sin starts to creep in. You see, our imperfect heart is treacherous and desperate, as Jeremiah 17:9 says, who can know it? And if we don't allow that trust to get into our hearts, then our heart can start to fabricate situations so that we can get away with it, or rationalize things in our minds, or justify wrong acts just so that we can get involved in these things. You see, sometimes we're giving counsel regarding our entertainment, music, reading material, or these things. How do we respond? Is our hearts tuned in to the understanding that Jehovah is giving us loving counsel and we trust that what he is saying is correct? Or because our trust is now taken away and our hearts start to harden, do we start to justify that, oh, I can do whatever I want? Do we rationalize, no, that doesn't affect me. You know, I can handle this thing. I can handle bad association. I know what 1 Corinthians 15:33 says, but I can handle that. It's no problem. You see, this is what happens. It's a gradual erosion of our Christian standards, and suddenly we're entrapped like that spider's web. Brothers and sisters, I don't know anyone who wakes up one morning and says, today I'm going to get up and commit fornication. It doesn't happen. Why? Because we know what the laws and principles are about that. But what happens if we start to let our hearts harden and we start to rationalize and justify principles that Jehovah set for us, eventually our standards start to erode, the deceptive power of sin comes, and before we know it, our hearts are desensitized, calloused, and hardened. And the problem with a hardened heart, or a heart that has calluses around it, there's no way for counsel or love to penetrate it. And usually the response has to come from another way, another angle to smack us. So it may be to waken us to attention. And then it may be too late at times before we're shocked into reality that we're following a wrong path. You know, my nephew works in construction, or he worked in construction. And he was working with a sharp cutting instrument. And he had only been on the job a couple of days. And he was cutting with this sharp blade, and he cut most of his index finger off. And what happened is they had to do a skin graft from his palm, just so it would look cosmetically good. And they put the skin graft on and put it all together, and now it cosmetically looks okay, but the scar is still there. And I was having lunch with him, dinner with him about 3 weeks ago, and I saw he was eating it. He was not using this finger. He was constantly gesturing. When he pointed, he'd point like this, and he'd do gestures like this. He wasn't using his finger. And I said, is it because the finger's immobilized? And he said, no. He said, once that happened, and they did the graft, it became callous and hard. And I can't feel anything with this finger. So in order to get any sensations or gestures, I learned to just work around the finger. And I forget that I'm really doing it because there's no sensation. Friends, if we don't respond to the counsel of the scriptures and the counsel that we get in the literature, in the Bible, and by our loving elders and by the slave class, and we allow our hearts to be hardened, there's no way that counsel can get into our hearts. There's no way we can feel what Jehovah's trying to tell us. And sometimes, like him, he has to find other ways to get feeling and that sensation. Sometimes when counsel comes to us in another shocking way, that's the only way we can respond, because the channel that we should be using is hardened. So that's why Paul wrote that example, beware of a lack of faith, that sin that easily deceives us. We should never, ever, ever underestimate the power of this sin. You see, there's a difference from drawing away from Jehovah and drifting away. You see, a person who drifts away just basically isn't paying attention to direction. Maybe he's so caught up in his life and his anxieties and his life and his family or whatever it may be. There's so many other things going around that before he realizes it, he makes a misstep and he's on a bad path, and that person can be corrected. But see, someone who draws away deliberately loses out because they lose all interest and concern about Jehovah, his laws, his ways, his principles, and because of that, recovery is usually difficult. This type of person starts to shift blame and responsibility. Oh, the reason why I'm not coming to the meeting is because of those elders. Or the reason why I married out of the truth is there's no good brothers in the congregation. Or the reason why I was saying that those friends are so cold in that congregation. And they start shifting blame. Whereas we should be looking inwardly as far as what is our heart teaching us and telling us. Friends, this is a frightful situation to fall into. Well, how do we counteract it? Are we left without any hope? Well, to avoid this fatal outcome, Paul continues reading in Hebrews 3. This time let's look at verse 14. It says, "For actually we become partakers of Christ if only we make fast our hold on the confidence we had at the beginning firm to the end." What we have to do is to recall in our heart that joy and zeal we had when we first got the truth. Do you remember how you were when you first got baptized? How excited you were. You know, there's a saying sometimes that people who are newly baptized have to be like locked up a little bit. They're talking to everybody, their family, neighbors, their friends, everyone. They just bring out the truth. We're just bubbling over with joy. Well, is that zeal still there? Is that love, that fire, that devotion still there? That's why Paul says we may have to go back to that confidence we had at the beginning and pull that with us firm to the end. Go back to those feelings that we had before. There's 4 things we need to do to hold fast that confidence. The first one, friends, is be quick to respond to the proddings of our Christian-trained conscience. Be quick to respond to our Christian-trained conscience. Never ignore it. If our conscience tells us to do something, follow it. If it's Christian-trained. If it's following those principles. Never say, well, I can, make excuses, I can start to justify. But if we have the principles down and we have the basic knowledge and we've gone to mature ones to help develop our conscience, then follow that Christian-trained conscience. The second point, never neglect personal study, prayer, and our ministry. These things keep us focused, firm to the end. It helps keep our faith strong. Personal studies our personal study can help us develop a firm confidence in Jehovah. Now, we're not talking about studying for the meeting, studying for the school and service meeting, watchtower, the book study. You know why? That's homework. We have to do that just to keep up with this theocratic organization. Personal study is exactly what it's called, a study that's personally geared to us. So, if we're depressed, pulling out all the articles and references we know about depression. If we're dealing with the death of a loved one, pulling out all the information dealing with that. If we're dealing with a sick parent or a sick mate or a troubled child, or whatever the situation you may be, we do personal study geared on those things. As Psalms 1:1-3 talks about, happy is the person that reads Jehovah's law. And at the end it says, everything he or she does will succeed. So we have Jehovah's personal guarantee that if we keep our personal study up, then we are guaranteed success. Prayer. Prayer is a lifeline to Jehovah. It keeps us in touch with Jehovah. It keeps us focused on his ways, reminders, and orders. One Watchtower, the April 15th, 1995, says, Jehovah has not delegated that privilege of prayer to anyone, not even his son. So that is the way we get a personal tie-in with Jehovah, through prayer. Now, how many of us have that personal tie-in with someone in charge? You ever have a problem with AT&T or the gas company, and you say, I want to talk to the person in charge, and you dial and go, please hold, and you wait, and they give you a secretary and a manager. Do you think you'd ever be able to talk to the president of any of these companies? But here, Jehovah has allowed us to talk to him personally. He has not delegated that privilege to anyone, not even his son, Jesus. And our field ministry, friends. This is where we get joy and satisfaction, knowing that we're doing everything Jehovah has commanded of us. The third area When the temptations come our way and we're thinking about falling into those ways, go to Jehovah then. Pray at that point. Pray before the sin starts. If we learn to focus in and go to Jehovah then, before the sin starts, then we can get the assistance we need. And the fourth area, and this is probably key for us, friends, staying close to our fellow Christians, close to our brothers and sisters. Usually when our faith comes into challenge, we sometimes, instead of reaching out to our brothers and sisters, we go inwardly and we say, I can handle the problem myself. But Proverbs 18:1 says, the one isolating himself against all practical wisdom he'll break forth. So when we have problems, these other friends we should come to, our brothers and sisters at the meetings. Now we may say, well, I have a problem with the brothers and sisters. I don't understand them. Well, that means that we should grant recognition to our brothers and sisters. Get to know them, get to be friends with them, understand their frailties, their likes, their dislikes, their weaknesses. And if we come to make personal allowances for our brothers and sisters, then we can start to love them. But if we focus in on our own problems like the Israelites and our own needs and our own wants, there's no way we can grant recognition to each and every one in the congregation. Now, what do I mean by granting recognition? It means granting recognition to our young ones. Our young ones should be praised for being able to come to the meetings, sitting quietly, listening to the meetings, coming with their parents, being obedient, listening to the information here. We should grant recognition to our young ones and tell them that we love them, we appreciate them coming to the meetings. We should grant recognition to our older ones. Friends, there's brothers and sisters here that have been in the truth 30, 40 years, that have faithfully been serving Jehovah. Do we appreciate them and understand their love and their sacrifices, or do we throw them to the curb, realizing that they're past their prime, they can't do anything for us? We should grant recognition to these ones. We should grant recognition to our Bethelites. Do you think it's easy to move from somewhere else, some other nice part of the country, move to New York, get away from all your friends and family that you know, come to a congregation that no one knows you, and sit and worship and go out with people that you hardly even know? That's a sacrifice. And live in a room with 3,000, 4,000 other people? That's a sacrifice. We should grant recognition to our brothers and sisters that do that. We should grant recognition to our local friends, those who have fought the fine fight here in the New York area that are still living in these conditions. And though it's unnatural almost to live in New York, living on top of each other in close proximity, brothers and sisters, we should grant recognition to our local friends who serve faithfully here in the congregation. We should grant recognition to our pioneers who are putting 70 hours in a month, faithfully serving Jehovah, being the first ones in the forefront carrying on the message. So we grant recognition to them. You see, if we start to understand what all our brothers and sisters are doing in the congregation and realizing the sacrifices they're making for us, then we will never, ever neglect our meetings. We will never neglect the association that we have here in the congregation. By staying close to our organization, we benefit by Paul's example there again in Hebrews chapter 3, where he says, the first part of 13, but keep on exhorting one another each day. That's the purpose of our meetings, to build up and encourage each other day by day. To drive home his counsel, Paul repeated the statement he made at Hebrews 3:8 by repeating it at Hebrews 3:15, where he says, while it is being said today, if you people listen to his own voice, do not harden your hearts on the occasion of causing bitter anger. Friends, hold firm the faith that we have to the end. Remember that spider's web. The insect thought he was safe because he relied on his own thinking. We never know what's out there. Satan has been spinning webs for thousands of years. We are no match for him. The only way we can stand firm in this time of the end is keeping our faith intact, avoiding the hard, corrupting influences of this system, and doing all things for Jehovah God's praise. If we hold firm our faith to the end, we can look forward to the day under Christ's rule when all things will be restored to perfection because we avoided a lack of faith. Well, this brings our meeting to a conclusion, friends. Let's stand and join in singing song number 144.